So I have two versions of the text up here. And I'm not sure if I want to read from the NRSV, which is wonderful, or whether I want to read from the Message, which I think is equally wonderful. I have to sort of preface today, I've been in Chicago for the last 2 days at a preaching workshop. And so perhaps this is coloring why today is so discombobulating for me. I had this sermon all planned, written out, ready to go, and then I go away and I learn some things from my old preaching professor, and I'm going, oh, I have to redo my sermon. And that seems to happen, doesn't it? We get some new information or some new technique and we want to use it immediately because we don't want to lose that gem that we've just been given. And while I was away, we worked on one particular text from Jeremiah, and the questions that kept coming up from this text, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, why did I not see that before? And all night I kept waking up doing the same thing with this text. Why didn't I see that before? Question after question after question. So we're in the book of Luke, and Jesus is talking to the crowds, and he's given sort of this series of parables, if you will, about things being lost. In chapter 15, we start out with the story of the lost sheep, and then we move into this little story of the lost coin, and now we are presented with the story of the lost son. Now, these are the titles that the writers of this particular Bible gave this text. And I imagine, like many, every time I've heard this sermon preached, or this text preached, they always focused on the lost son. And it always seems to go sort of the way of the son was greedy, he wanted his now. So he asked his dad for the inheritance, and he took off and he went and squandered his life to the point that he ended up having to work for a farmer by feeding the pigs. And then he has this epiphany that even the servants have more than he has back at his dad's home. And so he throws his little stick and rucksack over his back and heads back home. He's greeted with a robe and a kiss and a ring and much well wishes from his father. But we forget about the other characters in this story. And so I had titled my sermon for today, Do the Next Right Thing. And that still works for me, but with a twist. You know, too often we think that when people make wrong decisions, and I use that word loosely, that they're doing the wrong thing, that they've messed up somehow. Well, what does it mean to do the next right thing? If I made all the right decisions in my life, whatever that may be, I'm not sure I'd be standing in front of you today. Because it was many of the wrong decisions that I made that led me into ministry. And so I'm wrestling with this idea of what does it mean to make the right decision, the next right thing, to do the next right thing. And sometimes I think we confuse doing the next right thing with just doing the right thing. As in there's some right or wrong here that makes or breaks us. And I don't know about you, but growing up, I was told, I don't know how many times, you know what the right thing is. And teachers would say that, you know how to do the next right thing. You know what the next right thing is for you to do. As if there was some manual somewhere that says this is the decision that you're always supposed to make in this circumstance. And so when I'm angry and I want to hit you, I'm not supposed to do that because that's not right. But as children, do we know that? We don't know that. We're just responding to emotion. And so I'm wrapped up in this text and I'm going, but the kid that left home, didn't he do the next right thing for himself? He needed to experience something that he could not experience at home. And so he went away and he experienced the world. Now, the text doesn't tell us if he got what he was looking for. It doesn't give us any commentary on that. But I suspect that he probably didn't get what he was looking for initially. Sometimes when we leave home, our expectations are that everything is going to be hunky-dory. And it's not always. I was raised in the kind of family where we didn't really talk about money. We didn't talk about saving money. We didn't talk about how we spend money. And so when I left home at 17, I had to figure that stuff out. It's like, oh, I can't eat steak on my dime anymore like I ate steak at home because it's too expensive. So I need to eat cheap chicken. Okay? So you learn these things, but you have to go away from that safe environment in order to get those kinds of lessons. And so I think we discount the experiences that the son had who left home, and we think that somehow he was the bad kid. And this morning I'm going to push back against that and say, no, he was the adventurous kid. There were things that he needed to learn that he could not learn at home. Well, there's some other characters in this story. We have the father, we have the servant, we have the son who stays, and we also have the man who gives the prodigal son a job. And we never hear anything about these characters. So let's focus on the father for just a moment. Now, in the text, the father doesn't even argue with the son. Now, I'm reading this and going, this is about as realistic as the day is long. What father would not argue with their child about receiving their inheritance and going off to live whatever kind of life? I mean, my dad would have pushed back against that in a big way. You can leave, but I'm not going to give you anything to help you on your way. Okay, here's $5 for the bus, and don't spend it all in one place. That idea that we're going to get some inheritance before it's time to inherit just seems odd to me. But for the sake of the story, the father doesn't push back. He graciously gives the son what he asked for. And probably says Godspeed. Now, the second question that kind of emerged for me, does that mean that the father doesn't really love his son because he didn't push back? Or because he gave the son what he wanted, does that mean that he did love his son? I don't know. I have to think about that. But there's one thing we do know about the father that the text does tell us. When the son returned, the father was so overjoyed at the return of his son that he wept. He put a robe around his shoulders. He gave him a ring. He had the fatted calf killed because he wanted to celebrate the return of what was lost. Now that sounds like a father. So could we say that the father did the next right thing? I think he did. I think he did what he thought was in front of him to do. He was limited in his choices. He could have argued, he could have made it difficult for the son to leave, but he made a choice not to do that. Perhaps he recognized that if he had tried to stop the son, that it would have just alienated the child even more. There was a moment in thinking about this that I thought, wow, this is a great, and I never thought about it before, this is a great parable for the social worker in me, because I see family systems theory all over this. And I just want to analyze this family according to family systems theory. And I know that many of you don't even know what that means, and that's okay. Trust me, it's a really cool thing. Because you figure out like the first child and the second born and their roles in the family and the dynamics between. I mean, this is a perfect parable for all of that. So the father is playing a role. And I think he played it well. Then we have the servant. The servant shows up briefly. He's told to kill the fatted calf, and the servant does what he's told. We certainly would say that he did the next right thing, because if he had refused, if he had had an attitude about it, grumbled, I can't believe you're killing the fatted calf, because, you know, he went away. Why are you doing this for him? No, he didn't say a word. He did what he was told. If you're like me, there are times when I don't want to argue with the request. It's easier to just do what I'm asked to do. When my dad asked me to do things, it was imperative that you did it right away, because you didn't want the wrath. Or when mom said, get up, come here, you got up and you went. There was a certain respect that we had in our home for our parents. Even if we disagreed, we still followed the command. Well, so we would definitely say that he did the next right thing. And then there's the son who stays. And this is where it gets messy. Because this particular child, all he wants to do is complain. Boy, he pitches a fit. He's out working and slaving in the fields and doing exactly what his father asked him to do. And he comes in and there's a party going on and he doesn't even know about it. I think I'd be upset too. But what he says is, I can't believe that you would give this kid all of this money. You would let him go off and squander it all, and then you welcome him back with open arms, and here I've been working for you day and night, and you've done nothing for me. Now, if you have children, I imagine that you've heard this scenario before, especially if you have more than one child. The son who stays, did he do the next right thing? Sometimes I think the paths that we take, whether it's leaving home or staying home, that each of those paths have their own lessons. Sometimes we get to where we need to be when we go through a lot of resentment and anger. Sometimes we get to where we need to be when we figure out that we are not where we want to be anymore. Sometimes we make decisions based on self that turn out to be disastrous. And we pick ourselves up and we brush ourselves off and we decide to make a different decision. When we get beyond that moment, we don't look back on that and go, man, I am so defined by that decision. No, we don't, or hopefully we don't. We look back and go, wow, I sure learned a lot. I won't do that again. I remember the first time I heard Jeff Foxworthy, a comedian, the guy who does You Might Be a Redneck, to kind of put that, yeah. So he was talking about his dad having this monster TV on top of a TV tray. Right, and you know, so Jeff Foxworthy now, he's got a small child and he's saying, Dad, you can't do that. He said, oh, let him pull that TV down on him once. He won't do it again. But don't we do that? We're so curious. We want to see what's going to happen if I touch that hot stove. Ouch, that's hot. And then we don't do it again. We figure out by making mistakes what works and what doesn't work. Well, the son who decided to stay, yes, he might have been doing the right thing by not leaving, by not adventuring out. But what he ends up with was a pile of resentment and anger. What he failed to recognize is the blessing that was always in front of him to begin with. And then we have the man who hires the prodigal son. He's the least talked about character in this story. He gets such a brief mention. But he's a pig farmer. And it would be assumed that since Jesus is telling this parable that this son is probably Jewish, and Jews kind of detest pigs, and so the fact that the son was willing to take this job that was offered to him to go out and actually feed pigs in the field says something about this son's character. He was willing to do what was necessary in order to survive. The son, though, that stayed at home, he was willing to do only what he was required to do. I think we miss opportunities to partake of life when we only do what we're required to do. Each of the characters in this story, they play a role, just like we do in our lives today. The thing that I think makes us focus on the son who leaves as opposed to the one who stayed is that it's easier to think about leaving, squandering, living a life that may not be socially acceptable. It's easy to see that as wrong. And so we lift up the son who stays at home as being right. But if I'm reading this text correctly, we may have it backwards. The character in which we come to life with, the parts of us that define us and and provide our values and our context for living. Those are the things that shape us into the people that we are today. And that includes every time we decided to stay and every time we decided to leave. The whole notion of doing the next right thing is about evaluating what is right for us, not for someone else. Sometimes it means we do the very practical things that are right in front of us to do. Things like washing dishes or doing a load of laundry or even walking the dog. Other times it might mean that we have to change how we think. If we're harboring resentments and anger, they only hurt us. If we are engaging in a particular behavior only because we think it will please others, then our motivations are definitely misplaced. If we think that others are going to make choices based on what is right for us, then we are asking them to read our minds. This is why it's called a choice. Each of us must make decisions based on the information we possess at the moment. The brother that stayed chose not to live into the fullness of his life. He cut himself short of the blessings that were already in his possession. Essentially, this story illustrates two paths to the same goal. The son who left needed to see the world. He needed to feel the weight of having to be self-sufficient. And in doing so, was able to then recognize what had always been available to him. Likewise, the son who stayed had to experience the anger and the resentment that he experienced toward his family to also come to that same realization. That everything his family possessed was already his. When I think about how we relate to God, how we come before God, too often we shortchange our experience with God. We don't recognize the fullness with which God has already blessed us. We don't see that everything that has been laid before us is for our taking. Whether we stay or whether we go, it is important for us to learn the lessons where we are. One of the things that I heard this weekend, how you see the world depends on where you stand. It is all about perspective. I think God is always calling us home. But home doesn't have to be a physical place. It doesn't have to be the farm that we left. Home is where the heart is. When we plug in and claim God as our own, no matter where we go, we're connected. The path that we're on, whatever that path may be, may lead you in very different directions from the person sitting next to you. But the goal may be exactly the same.